And here we are living at a moment when certain events are coalescing. We've been talking about the signs in the heavens, but what's really fascinating to me is the signs on the earth. Because I've got the news right here about how Russia has put the spike into the globalist ambitions of Davos from the World Economic Forum the moment he decided to disrupt the balance of power in Eastern Europe. We have China suddenly experiencing a massive, unpredicted, self-inflicted setback economically. What is God Almighty doing with China that's tapping the brakes of the great dragon? And then we have other headlines here that are coming in where North Korea, following the lead of China, like the awkward stepchild that Kim Jong-un is, they're locking down their entire country in a panic mode. Something is happening at this moment in history. It's as though the scales are tipping, and if we read it correctly, we're seeing a cosmic adjustment. God is hearing the prayers of his people. And the sovereignty of the United States, we're hearing about the surrendering of that to the WHO. We're covering that and so much more in these broadcasts. This specific broadcast is going to dial in exactly on what's happening in the prophetic activity of nations as God is unfolding his plan. And I'm going to tell you something. We had a book that predicted all this. I probably shouldn't have put Donald Trump on the cover of it. This is the book that covers 2020 to 2030. Sheep nations rising, economic collapse, the global passport they're working on right now, the currency reevaluation, the emergence of China, the redefinition of Iran and what it wants to do. 2020 to 2030, you can get the book of these cosmic predictions. The beauty of it is it becomes richer every day because the details we give are being substantiated by the headlines. Go to godschaoscode.com and you literally can be pages ahead of the news cycle because it's already in the code. If I say 2, 4, 6, what's the next number? It's 8 because there's a code. That's what this book is. We look at the code that God set up, and then we just predict what's the next digit in the sequence. We cover 10 years of sequences breaking out, and they're happening every day. You don't want to miss this broadcast. We're putting together the news with a prophetic perspective. Think about this. Imagine you have a people, never before in history has there been a people dispersed 2,000 years all over the world. Jerusalem taken over by Rome, boom, occupied, dispersed, and it's like a barren wasteland. Tribes living there, Bedouins, Arabs. And what happens is, never is the biggest miracle probably the last 150 years in terms of like big Red Sea moments. 2,000 years of uprooted people, and they're in Germany and Russia, and they're in England, and they're in South Africa, South America. And they all are restored back to their land. And get this, they all speak the same language. 2,000 years of other languages, and they're all speaking Hebrew. And they're all practicing the same religious rites. And they're all one mind, and what they basically, God maintained a cohesiveness in the Jewish identity such that when they went back to their little sliver of land the size of New Jersey in the Middle East, they were able to reform their own cohesive language, culture, history, tradition, and religion, boom, virtually overnight, after being scattered thousands of years. It's a phenomenon. So now you have a nation regathered on real estate that nobody would help them with, and they weren't even allowed to have weapons. They couldn't defend themselves. Every Arab nation that surrounded them said they would wipe them out. And so David Ben-Gurion, who was the leader of the nation, they figured out how to get, they knew they were going to have, they knew the moment they declared independence, they were going to be in a battle for survival with 7 nations. It's like the story of Abraham with all these kings. So Mercedes, what they did was they asked for agricultural implements, and they asked for tractors and stuff like that, and they retrofitted everything they got into artillery. They had to do it in kibbutzes. They had no economy. So they lived literally in little religious communities that farmed and fed each other and took care of their own defense. They mobilized an army to withstand 7 nations without being able to have guns. That's the miracle of what happened when Israel beat their enemies without an army, without weapons. They figured out how to get a hold of them through Jewish businessmen in the United States that work with them. So America from the beginning has always been there to help Israel, Jews helping Jews. So the fact that Jerusalem exists up until 1967 now, 1948 they became a nation. In 1967 they recaptured Jerusalem and they recaptured even the Temple Mount. But Moshe Dayan, if you don't know the story, he decided, it was probably a God thing, that he didn't go and take over the Muslim Temple Mount because he felt like he would leave that territory unoccupied. But he took over the rest of Jerusalem from the Gentiles. Remember, Arabs are Gentiles. So Jerusalem, Jesus predicted in 33 AD, was going to be trodden down by Gentiles. He's predicting the end of the nation of Israel before his death. He's basically saying, you guys are going to be like occupied by foreigners until the time of fulfillment, when the clock is hit the end of history as far as the Gentile era, and then history will roll back to Israel, the Middle East, and the Gentile nations are going to have to revolve around the history of what's happening in the Middle East. So here we are. What I'm trying to describe to you is Jesus saying the time clock was punched 1948. It began 1967. This prophecy, Luke 21:24, was fulfilled in our lifetime. And that means that we're watching the age when nations are going to rise and fall and rise and fall, and more you're going to see the Antichrist, Middle East, and foreign powers all revolving around events. So in a sense, history is already written. What isn't written is your role, the souls, and the sheep nations. That's what we're contending for, something which you hardly ever hear people talk about. But there are nations that are actually not going to roll over into the empire system. And Jesus said there will be signs in the sun and in the moon and in the stars and on the earth. Check it out. Signs in the sun. So be looking for these solar blasts, the solar eclipses. They're signs. And in the moon, interestingly enough, and that's why the blood moons are so significant, because the moons that show up, the blood moons that show up during these sacred feast days, Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles, when they show up, out of 365 days of the year, and they happen to line up, bam, on the 1, 2, or 3 critical holy days in Israel, which, by the way, the whole sacred calendar of Israel's observation of their schedule of sacred activity is lunar based. It's not based on the sun. The sun is the messenger for the Gentile nations. The moon is the messenger for the church and for Israel. And the stars are the messengers for the children of God that are going to become redeemed, or they are the children of Abraham, or the stars basically are symbolic of the children that will become part of the family of God. So you've got the sun giving one kind of message, the moon giving another. I didn't realize until I listened to a guy named Troy Bruin today, something very interesting he said. He said that the sun is a masculine figure always in the Bible. It's referred to as a bridegroom going out of his chamber. It refers to as a man running a race. So the sun is always a masculine figure of the Godhead. The moon is the feminine aspect of the Godhead, referring to the church. It reflects the sun, and it has a 28-day lunar cycle, which is like a woman's cycle, 28 days. When you see in the book of Revelation, chapter 12, the great reference to the woman with the 12 stars on her head, the moon under her feet, the moon is always referencing Israel and the church. So it's a feminine symbol. That's why you want to look at the blood moon and ask, what just happened on May 14th? What was God saying? And then Jesus says there'll be distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, and men's hearts failing them for fear of the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth. And why is it that these signs in the heavens are going to be speaking to us? Because the powers of the heavens will be shaken. What does that refer to? It refers to the spiritual forces that are in the heavens. Satan's cosmokroteros is what it would be called in the Greek. The layers of powers, principalities, and rulers of the darkness of this world. It's outlined in Ephesians by the Apostle Paul as an intelligent, well-ordered government of darkness that rules in this place we call second heaven, the atmosphere around the earth, and that God himself is shaking, disrupting, overturning, invading, and ultimately annihilating. And you're living in the time of tribulations, when you're living in the times that these thrones are under siege and God is returning to take control of planet Earth. And that's the collision of nations and systems. We see the shaking, but from heaven's perspective, it's an invasion back into Earth and God wrapping up the cosmic time clock. So these ideas are big ideas, but what they do is they provide a framework. And if you don't have the patience to develop a framework, then you can't see the picture. So the picture that I'm trying to present to you now is May 13th, May 14th, right this week, we just passed through a unique moment in history where at 11:11, now we're going to some interesting numerology. At 11:11, the lunar eclipse was at its maximum force. The moon turns red because of the refraction of light off of the earth from the sun. And so Jesus talks about the sun or the moon turning to blood. And that's why the blood moon becomes such an interesting subject line for these books you're hearing about, because it says in Joel that before the great and notable day of the Lord, the moon shall turn to blood. We're going to see the blood moon corresponding to seminal events that are taking place. And that blood moon is what we're going to come back in. I'm going to stop this broadcast here. Part one, really, for my purpose of this broadcast, is to give you China, Russia. I didn't even cover what's happening with the European Union, but that's been stalled. The Davos agenda is being frustrated. The globalist one world government plan they had using COVID and climate change and economic instability as a forced occasion for an economic global governance reset. Very real threat leading right into the empire beast system in its first form. It's been held off. And I see it all because I see it happening, because I'm going to show you in the next broadcast. The scales in the heavens, literally in the constellation of Libra, where the blood moon was fixated at 11:11. The 11th hour of history is upon us. The moment of decision for nations is going to shift. God is about to render a judgment of justice on behalf of the intercession of his saints, and God is going to begin to discomfit and disturb and overturn the powers of hell in their agenda over North America, because these other powers, as I'm looking in the last 30 days, God is almost sovereignly stalling them from their advantages so that they cannot overtake this country and destroy God's purposes and timing. This is the hour for the great uprising, the great awakening. Keeping an eye on that clock. We have to take a break right now, but we will be right back.
You know what's hard? Saving America. You know what's important? Getting a good night's sleep. How do we do that? With Mike Lindell bedding, pillows. And do you know who else needs a good night's sleep? Your pet babies. Did you know Mike Lindell has pet beds? My Pillow, special for your fur babies. Bedding. Go check it out. You go to mypillow.com and be sure you use the promo code Lance, because you're going to save tons. So go check it out. Mike's got so many great products over there, other than the MyPillow, other than the bathrobes, other than the slippers that you're hearing about all the time. He's got tons of stuff. So go check out the website. I'm sure you don't have it all. We got to go out there and support Mike.
It was just brought to my attention that we're not going to another show next week, or we're actually going to the next show right now. We have 12 minutes for me to be able to give you It's going to be hard. The 12 points I was going to give you an entire other show was going to be that, but we're going to pack it in now. So for those of you that were kind of on cruise control with me during that first segment, buckle up. We're going to go somewhere now. So anyway, I get off the plane, and it's just a couple of days ago, and it's May 14th, and I'm being bombarded by emails from all my signs and wonders people out there that study these things. And they say, Lance, what about this blood moon that's happening? What about the total eclipse? Is there any significance in that? There are signs in the heavens, and the Bible does talk about it. And you even say that there's ample proof that God speaks to us in the heavens. I got off the plane because my flight was delayed. And I said, I'll cover it live. And I couldn't cover it live because it was nothing to see. It's an eclipse. I'm wandering around my backyard thinking, where is it? Well, of course, I couldn't see anything. But here's the weird part. Where does this blood moon show up? The blood moon, which is a sign in the Bible, look at what it means, it shows up in the constellation Libra. Now, if you've got the pictures back there, producers, over there, can you bring up some of these pictures? I want to show you some. So you see the Libra as a constellation is where the blood moon arises. Now, even in this picture, it's a little bit off because you see that knob on the top of the scales of justice? That actually was where the blood moon showed up, not to the left, not to the right, but exactly in the middle, right up to lining up with that brightest of stars. So show the next picture. When the moon, well, actually, that wasn't what I was thinking of. Every one of those, that's it. When the moon actually came into alignment for the eclipse, and then the eclipse ended, you have this blazing blood moon situated at the very epicenter of the scales of justice. Now that to me struck me as being interesting because Libra, as a heavenly symbol, in terms of the signature in the heavens, and this is too much to cover in the 12 minutes here, but the reality is that the stars have been hijacked by, the zodiac has been taken over by astrologers. But what that's done is it's kind of like it's ripped off for the Judeo-Christian world what Genesis says, which is, and the stars are set for you for signs in the heavens. And then you have Jesus repeating that. There will be signs in the sun and in the moon and in the stars and on the earth. So if you can't read the signs, Jesus said, that are visible in nature, how are you going to understand when I talk about more mystical, abstract ideas if you can't even read the obvious? So Jesus is saying, read the obvious. What is obvious here? Well, what's obvious to me is the timing of this thing is significant. The blood moon refers to the blood. Now, what does the blood mean? The blood is for Christians and for Jews. The blood is the price that is paid for the redemption of mankind. The lamb was sacrificed on the altar at Passover, and the Messiah was crucified at the Passover because Jesus said, this is my blood which is shed for the sins of the world. So you have this idea of a cosmic sacrifice. Jesus identified himself that way. And when he bled, he was bleeding so that the scales of justice could be satisfied. So those scales speak of the blood that was shed for the redemption of mankind, which means it's even more amazing to me that this very day that this happens, 11/11, I'm going to come back to that in a minute, in the constellation of Libra, the blood is speaking to who? Israel and to the church worldwide, that God is doing something. And the same day is what's called Second Passover. It's an unusual element in Numbers chapter 10. You can read it in verses 9, 10, and 11, where Moses is confronted with the realization that there are certain people that missed the Passover, and this is a significant holy day for Israel. And if they missed the Passover, once they had left Egypt, they kept celebrating it. What did they do if they were out in the wilderness, or if they were defiled? Because the one thing that could disqualify you from being with a group of other people, it's like the anti-vaxxing, is if you touched a dead body. You were contaminated. You had to quarantine yourself. So how do you do Passover? So Moses went to the Lord and said, Lord, is there new? What do I tell them? The Lord said, there shall be a second Passover. For those that missed the first offer of the blood to cover them and grace to protect them when the plagues come out upon the earth, they can come in with. So in other words, what you got is the mercy of God is giving last call. He's giving a call to you, America. He's giving a call to those that are listening. That if you may have missed something before, it's not too late, America. You can come in under the blood. You can align with the will of God. You can move the scales of justice in tipping in righteousness for redemption and for God's intervention. And so the second Passover, on the same day that the blood moon shows up in the constellation of the scales of balance and judgment over the heavens and the earth, Libra. Now, if that isn't strange enough, I got 6 minutes. I got so much. It's mind-blowing. If I had a fright wig, I'd go woo like that on my head right now. Listen to the stars that make up the constellation. Show me another picture. Chelsea, do you have a picture with the stars that make up the constellation of Libra? I know I gave you more than that. Throw one up there. You'll find one. Here's the constellation. These are the stars that make up the prophetic constellation within Libra. There's one star called Crux, Latin for the cross. There's another star for lupus, which is the victim. There's another, so you see those stars there, those various points that are there? Then there's the star which is corona, that is the crown. Then there is the other stars that make up the constellation of Libra, which is Mazoneim, which means in the Hebrew to weigh in the balance. There is Alzubina. Now these are all the stars as if you were an astronomer and you were studying their Greek etymology and their origin. This is the language you got because in Greek and in Roman history, there was an oral. Bring that back up. Bring the picture back up. That's interesting. So the stars that make up the points of that image actually are Crux, the crown, Lupus, the victim, Corona, Crux, the cross, Mosaneum, weight in the balance, Alzubina, which is redemption, and Zubin al-Ganubi, which is, it sounds like a Star Wars character, but it refers to the purchase. So listen to what this means. Now you can bring the camera back to me. I'm going to read to you the story of redemption in the house of Libra in the stars. That there is a cross requiring a victim who will be crowned. Once weighed in the balance, redemption will be provided because the purchase has been made. Bam! This was in the stars going back to Genesis. This is the story that was in the heavens. These are the names that were given to these various constellations and stars. And what I'm trying to tell you is, in the midst of that narrative comes the blood moon, the blood speaking of redemption, the blood speaking of a price. Now, what that means is, let me see if I can cover this here, going over to my board. So we have at 11:11, suddenly, the moon comes into its ultimate position as the scales of justice with these points. I just gave you Crux and the crown and these star points all have different names. I gave you what the constellation names were. But what makes it interesting to me is 11:11. Have you seen the number 11:11, ladies and gentlemen? Now, I know for some of you that are pure secularists, you're scratching your head. But you might be married to somebody that says, well, I see that number all the time. There are people seeing the number 11:11 because what we find is these numbers have meaning. For instance, World War I ended on the 11th month at the 11th day, and the 11th hour, the armistice was signed. Veterans Day is 11/11. It's the day on which veterans are honored. And if you don't mind me saying so, and stretching in this last 2 minutes, there's a symbolism behind the fact that the peak point of this moment with this eclipse with the blood moon was 11:11. The verses, what does 11 mean? 10 in the Bible is a number of ordinal perfection, the 10 commandments, everything in order. 12 is the number of government, 12 apostles, 12 gates into the great city of Jerusalem, 12 breastplates for the tribes of Israel, 12 stones. 12 is the number of heavenly government. Ordinal perfection, the ordinances aligned in 10, government in 12, 11 is transition. When it's 11:11, you're in the 11th hour, 11:11, you're in the very moment of change. 11 refers to transition. When Judas betrays Jesus, there are 11 disciples remaining. They have to cast lots to get back into alignment with God's government. So 11 refers to, but get this, 1 minute left. In the Hebrew, every letter has a meaning as a word. Every word has a meaning as a letter. That means that when you total up the number 1111, 1111, it's the Hebrew word for trouble, corrupt, get this, tattler, and liberal. Strangely enough, those are, and you got that leaked in the Supreme Court. The scales of justice in the Supreme Court, a decision made for life in the Supreme Court. It may have more significance in the balance of God's intervention for America than any of us have thought. The tattler, the trouble, the corrupt, the liberal. It's talking about God in the court system of heaven executing a judgment, because the brightest star of all those stars is the star Libris, which is the star that says we're being weighed in the balance. And I think the scales are tipping in divine intervention for North America, where God is ready to reveal the election theft to those that are willing to see it, where God is willing to reveal corruption in the Russian collusion. God is going to reveal the content of a Hunter Biden lab. God's going to reveal the complicity and conspiracy of technology and news sources suppressing news. And I pray that God reveals the race game that they're playing now as they're ignoring black shooting incidents in New York and in Wisconsin, and they're focusing instead on one incident. They're ignoring an incident of a Chinese shooter in a church last weekend against a Taiwanese church. Why? Because the corruption is boiling over, and I believe it will be exposed. More on this in our next episode.
Did you enjoy this latest episode? Please remember to share it with your friends, because the more knowledge you have, the better it puts you. See you tomorrow.
You know, everybody talks about being prepared. What happens when the bubble bursts? What happens when the dollar collapses? Are you ready? Are you prepared? Do you have emergency food kits? Do you have gold and silver? I want to talk to you about something you might not have heard of yet, and it's called hydroponic gardening. And it is one of the coolest things I have secretly fallen in love with over the last 8 to 9 months. I have an entire gardening system. And let me tell you what, it's enough food not to just feed my family, but to feed my neighbors. I have 36 different types of plants growing in this thing. I have lettuce, I have beans, I have strawberries. I have so many different things. And it's just one more tool in my arsenal to making sure that I'm ready to take care of my family and my friends and my neighbors if need be. And so I want to tell you about it. It's this really cool system. It's called Let Us Grow. And if you're interested in finding out more and finding out how you can have one of these, it grows vertically. It's a hydroponic garden. You might not even know what that means. It's an entire system where it's just water-based. There isn't a ton of dirt. You don't have to worry about bugs and pests or anything like that, because you can actually do this in your home, which means you can grow plants year round. It's so cool. I just did it through the entire fall and winter. And like I said, I have just had such abundance with it. So I want you to check it out. You can go to lancewallnau.com/garden and get all of the details on the Let Us Grow system. And be sure you stay tuned, because I just put one together for the office, and it took me less than 10 minutes to put the entire system together. And it just snaps together. You fill it up with water. You give the plants their nutrients. 30 minutes per week is all you're looking at for maintenance. So I'm telling you, go check it out. I'm going to have before and afters on the screen when I'm talking about this, so you can see the type of abundance I'm talking about. Be prepared. Go to lancewallnau.com/garden